Welcome to Beatle Blethers with Gerry
Okay,
and Alan.
welcome everybody to the latest Beatle Blether. This is our, well, we won't tell you how many goes we've had at this, but this is our third episode of season 2, and we are going to use it to explore the wonderful life and times of none other than Mr. Ringo Starr. So we hope you'll enjoy that. So, Gerry, Ringo, as often called the final piece of the jigsaw, isn't he? The one that actually made the Beatles, rather than just another good Liverpool band, possibly.
That's right. I suppose also that there's the people that lived through this era who Ringo then came into the story, and there's people like me and even more you who are second generation Beatles fans who came in the 70s or the 80s. Ringo was always there for us. Ringo always was a Beatle, and then you learn the complex story. So there's so many, like all the stories of the Beatles, there's so many layers and personas of Ringo. There's the affable, slight buffoon, he sometimes plays it, the comic and so on, and the one who just is the glue and so on. But he is, as you say, I mean, it's called John, Paul, George, and Ringo for a reason. The chain, the order they were invited in the band by whom. Ringo is the last missing link, and Ringo is clearly not a musical genius on the level of the other three, but he has, I mean, I would say, I think the word genius is thrown about too much all over the world, but he has some element of musical geniusness or whatever the plural of it is, you know.
Yes, he does. I mean, that's the integral kind of bit that he brings to the mix. The rest of the genius wouldn't be quite as genius without it. And it is a particular type of contribution to know to so perfectly know your role in a group, and to not be battling for sort of a frontman status or anything like that. And I think that must have been tremendously useful for the other three, especially latterly when they were all producing world-class songs of their own. So he's an absolute gem. So this is going to be a lovely chat to talk about young Mr. Starkey.
Yeah.
So shall we start at the beginning? Do you want to give us a wee?
Let's start at the beginning, because Ringo is inarguably the most working class of all the four Beatles. Clearly, Paul and George are also inarguably working class. There's an argument that John's had a sort of middle class life, given living with his aunt. The house had a name, etc. You know, that wasn't something you knew about in Britain in the 50s and early 60s. And also Ringo's working class, where Ringo working class isn't a misnomer for disadvantaged or so on. Working class was a prosperous working class in Liverpool. It was an empire city, a bit like Glasgow, port city. But Ringo was significantly disadvantaged and had a very, very complex childhood, didn't he? And had to navigate great reverses and 2 periods of severe illnesses that, in a way, made his resilience. They brought him to how he became a drummer, etc. And maybe just want to say a bit about that, because Ringo's life is an incredibly moving and revealing one, and particularly his early years, let alone his fame years.
Yes, and very grounding, evidently, as well. He's a man who's kept his feet on the ground through some pretty unbelievable and unprecedented levels of fame and notoriety. So his first sort of mishap in life or difficulty was his dad, I think, leaving when he was about 3 years old. When Ringo was 3, Ringo's dad left the family. I don't think he'd taken much interest in being a dad. And in those days, of course, that meant that Ringo's mum had to go out to work, and I think she worked several menial jobs to keep him fed and watered, and she did an amazing job of that by all accounts. But Ringo was also plagued, as you say, with ill health, and this was one of the last sort of stories about Beatledom that I actually picked up on, because
Me too.
Yeah, as you say, by the time he's entered the picture of the Beatles, he's kind of he's fine. He's in pretty decent health, and he's obviously very happy and very pleased with his new role. But prior to that, it was a sair fecht for our Ringo, and he was in hospital for literally years as a child. First bout when he was was it 5 or 6?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's 3 years total in hospital. It's a fair
of his childhood,
fortunate part of your life to 15, 16, you know.
That's right. With, of course, the consequence that he missed out on most of his schooling. So he's a bit of an autodidact, really. He's had to pick things up by himself, and also with help from family members and friends. I think it was a very loving upbringing, and I think that the thing that probably mitigated against those misfortunes really playing a terrible role in his life was the genuine love and support that he had from his mum Elsie, and also his stepdad, Harry, who appeared on the scene, I think when before Ringo was a teenager, Harry had appeared. And he seems to have been a really wonderful man from whom Ringo claims to have learned gentleness. And if there's anything that you can get from your father figure, I think gentleness is one of the most impressive and welcome contributions a dad can make. Yeah. So he had bad luck, but he did also have some good fortune. You know, I think you'd probably say his family life was maybe more stable than John's, despite being more deprived financially. But yeah, so the second bout in hospital was the one that changed the world for him, because during his teens, when he was in there, the hospital provided activities for the kids in the ward, including music lessons, and somebody would come round with instruments and invite the kids to have a go, and that's where Ringo picked up his first drum.
Yeah,
and it's fair to say it was love at first sight.
I know.
So from misfortune comes tremendous fortune. And this is a story actually that it's a pattern in Ringo's life, I think. You know, things which would knock other people down seem to increase his resilience and you know, his security in his role in the world.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Or navigating insecurity, I think it might be, because there are, you know, we'll get on this later. There are points where, because he's the last one in the Beatles, he never feels, always feels he's the odd one out for a whole variety of reasons, and feel the other three are the core ones that all get on with each other. But as you say, when I grew up, you know, finding the Beatles and becoming a Beatles fan in the 70s, and then I didn't know this story in the 70s because there wasn't that industry of wealth of material about the band, even though there was obviously lots of stuff, books even then. And I didn't know, I didn't know in the 80s either. And when I did find it out some point after the 80s, it kind of, well, not kind of, it changed my view of Ringo. It just really changed my view. I thought to have come through that and what he's navigated and what he contributed, and the brilliant musician, and not just the brilliant musician, but what he gave to the Beatles psychologically, which we can get on to, which is you know, he creates song titles. His humor is this brilliant connection with John, Paul, and George, and more than that, the camaraderie, the fact they are this cohesive unit towards the end. It's just like Ringo is integral to all that,
without a doubt. And I mean, was he destined for greatness? Whatever he did, Ringo he's such a particular character. He was the most famous of the four of them in the very early days, because he was with the much more successful band Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, who were they were the biggest band in Liverpool before the Beatles got back from Hamburg. Is that fair to say?
I guess, and am I right? Because obviously, you know, there's people who know these things more than us, etc. And the minutiae of Beatles history. In the Beatles' Hamburg years, when they were invited to Hamburg, wasn't the first offer to Rory Storm and the Hurricanes?
Yes, and they couldn't go because they were booked in Butlins.
That's right.
And
the
Beatles were actually quite an unwelcome, because they hadn't really earned their chops yet at that point. Are we talking 1961? 1960. Yeah, so there had been other acts that had gone over. I think had King Size Taylor had they gone over, and there were a few Liverpool bands. There was an exchange that was going on, but the Beatles weren't really on the radar, because at that point they were still going through drummers like Spinal Tap, and the you know, when they didn't have a drummer, they had their the rhythms and the guitars thing, which was just them being a bit cheeky thinking, but their self-belief certainly wasn't ever in any doubt. But there was definitely, they were not quite ready to take over the world yet. Meanwhile, in Butlins and in various theatres and things in Liverpool, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes were cutting quite a dash. Very physical kind of performer. Rory used to climb up behind Ringo onto an amp stack and leap over Ringo's head onto the stage. They're all in kind of neon-coloured zoot suits and things. So real showmen before the Beatles had any kind of idea of a unified look or a unified sound and that kind of thing.
Here's just a quick aside. I'll keep this one short. I've been just, for thinking about this video and others, I was just reflecting on the fact that my dad, like many of his generation, maybe yours, my dad did national service. And my dad did national service from 1958 to 1960, and he did it in Hamburg, right? And the funny thing is, I'm now thinking, so the references he made to Hamburg were always very small in life, and to the national service, because he'd had a trade before he went into national service. But he would refer to it as being very rough. You had to be very careful, and it was still 1960, well, 58 to 60. It's still war scarred. But I never got into a conversation. This is before the Beatles, obviously, about did he know the Hamburg of the Beatles? I missed that conversation somehow. You know that he was
that's a shame.
before.
Yes, he might not have wanted to tell you if he was spending much time down
That's
at the
what I
Reefer
thought.
Band.
I've only made that thinking about this, these discussions with you. But Hamburg is, it's one of the many foundation stones, maybe the most important foundation stone in this story. And Ringo, of course, it's Pete Best. We need to mention Pete Best for most of the Hamburg period, but at points, a couple of points, Ringo does take Pete Best's place. So Ringo plays with the Beatles before he becomes a Beatle, which is kind of
Yes.
important in the story.
And crucially, he was already a fan before he got asked to play with them, because he would go along. They were sharing the bill, weren't they? The Hurricanes and the Beatles, and it was a ridiculous work schedule. They were playing for 9 hours a night or something between them, and it'd be like 2 hours on, 2 hours. And Ringo would always stick around to hear the Beatles playing, and he thought they were phenomenal. He just thought they had something that nobody else really had. And for one thing that Ringo has never lacked, despite maybe coming from a background where aspiration isn't always at the forefront of your mind, is ambition. And he's always said that every band he moved from, he was looking for the best band to play with. He knew that he wanted to drum with the best musicians. Yeah. And seeing the Beatles playing in Hamburg, he was pretty sure that they were the best musicians. So he'd sit up at the front of in the clubs, getting slowly drunker and drunker and demanding requests from the band. And legend has it that actually they found him a slightly threatening character. They were a bit worried about him. It seemed, because he was the one from the rough part of town, as you say. Right. Even within working class demographics, there's obviously places where you feel safer than others. And Ringo had a tough time on the streets as a boy and had to join a gang and things for self-protection, and certainly witnessed some pretty brutal brawls and things. Liverpool, again, like Glasgow, I think was a very quite a violent city, or people expressed themselves physically, maybe. That's right. And so music was definitely a better option for him than some of the other things that could have come his way. But there are John, who's the sharp-witted, sharp-tongued rabble rouser. Even he was a bit kind of worried about this guy with this strange grey streak in his hair, sitting up at the front of the bar, shouting for him to play Nobody's Child again, and that kind of thing. Yeah. But then, as you say, he was invited up to join them, and legend has it, in fact, from Paul's own mouth and George's, the second that the four of them were together, there was a little frisson of, oh, right, this is what we've been missing. And yeah, we do need to mention, poor old Pete Best is one of history's less lucky folk, although, of course, latterly he has been warmly rewarded for his contributions with the anthology releases.
Right. But financially, they did them right by, it took them till 95, 96, because it's like lots of tragic or fascinating band stories. They were always a bit embarrassed by the Pete Best story. Not only couldn't they fire him, they were embarrassed in subsequent years, and quite visibly at points through the 60s when it was mentioned. Yes. And then eventually, right is done, and when the Pete Best Beatles tracks, some of them are released in 95, 96 on Anthology 1 to 3. Well, Anthology 1, obviously, of the 3 series.
Now, you might argue that makes him one of the least deserving millionaire drummers on earth, because he was not a particularly good drummer, Pete. He was fine for the clubs, and he was fine for just keeping a beat going. But he seems to have had one beat that he did for pretty much everything. And then when Ringo got up, Ringo was just much more versatile, and also listened to the music. So by Ringo's own account, his fascination with drumming didn't come from idolizing specific drummers or specific techniques. He just listened to the songs. And so his whole philosophy about drumming is, where does it fit in the song? It's not how technically brilliant is this or anything like that. That's not his main concern. It's what's the best way to, support the song. And that's an in-the-moment kind of thing, because, his fills and stuff are all very spontaneous, but they betoken a deep musical understanding and a real empathy with the other folk in the band. He would have been such a find. They were so lucky to find him.
I have to say that, absolutely. So Ringo's, in terms of chronology and that those historic moments of 62, June 62 is the EMI edition, in inverted commas. Then in 14th of August, 1962, they invite Ringo to be a member of the Beatles, and it's on the 18th of August is the first Beatles gig. Well, the first Beatles gig where Ringo is a Beatle, and then obviously then there's the session for Love Me Do, in which Ringo is sidelined and thinks, oh, they're doing a Pete Best on me, but it turns out, which some of us even didn't know for a while, you know, the Beatles music. Ringo, in terms of, is on the version that's released as a single. He's not on the version that's the album. But it's just from before I even started to think about Ringo, I just in my love of the Beatles, I've always been a bit what might be mesmerized by Ringo's drumming at points in songs, how it's like audacious, imaginative, courageous. You know, like just to maybe do a bit more of it chronologically, but on late tracks like Something, it just adds something dramatic that takes the song. It's not completely to the beat, is it? It's not.
Yeah, there's a musicality to it. I think that's the only way to describe it is it's a genuine musicality, an understanding of what's needed and where, which, you know, any band would kill for a drummer that can do that. And you know, we don't need to dwell on the kind of scurrilous, nonsensical reputations that people, you know, folk have tried to claim over the years that he's a substandard drummer, and those folk are never drummers, as far as I know. Those folk are just folk who, I think they've heard this as it's sort of received wisdom, oh ho ho, Ringo. But drummers, the drumming community of the world, I think, know very well, and certainly the.
I think that even, I mean, this is just a quick. I've not thought. I think the Ringo people dismissers fall into two camps. There's musical snobs, and we have that on every single subject about music. And then there's people that don't know what they're talking about. And I've encountered both versions of this. People that just have a passing familiarity with the Beatles canon and will make comments about Ringo because it's easy to patronize Ringo for reasons, some of which we've already mentioned. Him being the fourth member, being the drummer, being the less assertive of the four in public, etc. But he's he is a brilliant addition, and you know, there's his evolution as a drummer over the 8 years, let alone there's a significant part of his solo career that's worth talking about. It's just brilliant, and these are, as you know, these are path-breaking songs at some points in the key parts of their canon, and tracks like Tomorrow Never Knows, etc. With the limited technology they've got, his drumming is otherworldly.
It's phenomenal.
Holds to today as genius.
It absolutely does. And who was it? We were talking to J.R. Moores a few episodes ago, and if you haven't seen that, folks, go back and check it. It's a good one. Talking about George, but he was mentioning a friend who had listened to Tomorrow Never Knows and had assumed that beat was a loop. I thought that was just a, you know, do it once and then loop it, but it's not. It's live drumming all the way through, and it is so, you know, it's absolutely beat perfect, and it drives the whole thing. And then I think, you know, it was also used during on the Love album, the Cirque du Soleil album. They took that drum track and put it behind Within You Without You, George's song from Sgt. Pepper, and it's phenomenal on that as well. I mean, it was the most interesting mashup on there, I thought.
I mean, the way I think of things like, say, Tomorrow Never Knows, and obviously many others, his drumming to me, and you have better technical understanding than me, is the way I hear it and love it. The drumming practically acts to me like a counter chorus to the song. It's practically something I can sing, you know, and I with the whole genius of that song and John and Paul's tape loops, I can't think of just words fail me about how brilliant I think he's drumming, how it adds to this work.
Yes, and actually that's a really interesting one to look at because it shows Ringo's transition from live to studio. Of course, the whole band made that transition, but he was equally vital in both phases, it seems. And when you see the footage of the live stuff, you know, Ringo is just great, you know, shaking his head, having a fantastic time. He's holding it all together. And he had to do that by the latter 8 stages of the touring years, just by watching the guys and how they were moving, because he couldn't hear a thing. None of them could hear anything. So he was good enough and knew the songs well enough to be able to sort of tell from a wiggle of Paul's head or something like that where they were in the song and keep it tight. And then going from that very frenetic, must have been sort of skin of your teeth kind of playing to being able to spend weeks, months in the studio creating things. Of course, he didn't have quite the same input as Paul or John or George Martin in studio terms, or George. But when his moment came,
that's right,
he was right there and as interested in it as any of them in the studio developments and the possibilities of improving drum sounds and drum recording techniques and things. Absolutely vital to the whole process.
I think the point you're making as well is that what's interesting is that in the Beatles, you know, enduring fascination, that more and more the micro stories or the detail are coming to the fore. And one of that is, it's not a micro story, of course, is more interest in Ringo. And there's a Ringo biography by Tom Doyle this year, which we've both read. And there's a Ringo just out uncut after they've done John, Paul, and George. That's actually very good. I mean, there's a whole, Ringo's career deserves 150 pages. But there isn't. I've just thought of this now. Where is there's musicology of the Beatles. There is no study, I think, of the evolution of Ringo's drumming over the course of the Beatles.
Maybe not. Well, that's a niche that someone has to fill. I'm sure it'll get there eventually.
I'm sure we'll get there. And there's an open invitation for someone,
Yes.
More Anuraki than us.
Yes. There are nice videos on YouTube of drummers from around the world, Dave Grohl and folk, paying tribute and explaining exactly what it is that they have taken from him, or been inspired to do by him. And it always relates to the song. It always relates to the place within the song. It's not really about technical proficiency, although it's often noted that his style is unusual because he is, of course, a left-handed drummer playing a right-handed kit, which means his fills tend to be just ever so slightly behind the beat, and that doesn't mean offbeat. That means that it's a style that kind of gives it a loping quality, and a Ringo fill is instantly recognizable, whoever he's playing with. And of course, we'll maybe get on to some of the other folk that he has drummed for, because he was a much in demand session drummer in the early 70s once the Beatles broke up. But yeah, he's unique and brilliant. But it's not just that, is it? Because there were probably other technical drummers that could have joined them. But in terms of that perfect alchemy of personality, I just don't think there would have been another person who could have been such an effective peacemaker and diplomat, and kind of, as you describe him, the glue. He's just the one that all the other three can relate to. He just doesn't really seem to fall out with the others. No one's got a problem with him. No one's competing with Ringo. I know Paul occasionally wants to gig in on the drums a bit, but that's just Paul's enthusiasm for all things musical. But really, Ringo is the one that they can all fall back on and claim as a friend, and that continues long after the breakup as well, which is really lovely.
That's right. And obviously there's the period where they all go through hell and put themselves through hell. Though, as I now think now, when you view things in perspective, like the Paul John feud, which lasted really for a year and a half, mid 1970 to the end of 1971, they begin to make up early 72. It's not Roger Waters and David Gilmour, and a 40-year feud. It's
that's right.
Because people care, because the Beatles are this iconic band, it really matters. But Ringo is the addition to make them the four-headed monster, as Mick Jagger said. And Mick Jagger was saying that out of a bit of awe and a bit of, I think, jealousy in a sense, because they were dealing with this entity that they were friends, but they were also competitors.
Yes, and it's funny because that element of their career, and that was post Epstein, wasn't it? Because it was Brian, I think, that had suggested to go to the Bag of Nails or whatever it was that the Stones were playing. So they have already had a little bit of a makeover. I don't think they were still leather clad. They were in their long trench coats and things, and they will have looked quite impressive. But so that part of their career has kind of become a blueprint for boy bands over the years, that unity of look and things like that, but usually manufactured. And there was nothing manufactured about the Beatles' camaraderie. It was a genuine friendship built up over years. And then Ringo just managed to slot right in, which is an amazing thing to do. I don't know if our listeners or reviewers have ever tried to kind of break into a group that's already really, really tight. It's an extremely difficult thing to do. It's not something I make a habit of, by the way, but for Ringo to just have so quickly been so adopted and so embraced by the other three is just testament to his character. I think they didn't suffer fools gladly, John, Paul, and George.
When Ringo joins the band 62, Epstein becomes the manager 61. The alchemy between them is, and there was the recent, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, but the recent Brian Epstein film, I thought just didn't capture this at all. The love the Beatles had for Epstein and the love he had for them. And I'm not talking anything about the Brian Epstein, unsubstantiated rumors. Epstein created a new form of being a manager that, there's lots of things we could say about how he became out of his depths in terms of the business deals and so on, but he was charting a new course. There had never been a phenomenon of the scale of the Beatles, of Beatlemania, and in this global, like the Beatles conquer the world. So any actual manager would be out of his depth, but he also charted a new course by the fact he really cared about them. And they cared about him. And I think that's just a really, really lovely part and an important part of the story.
It is, it is. Now, Brian's contemporary accounts of Ringo joining suggest that he was a bit reluctant
Yeah,
to let
yeah,
Ringo join, but I suspect that's just because he hadn't really met him and didn't really know him. And maybe, Ringo is an unusual looking dude, he's a
right.
distinctive fella. And if you're going for a kind of middle of the road look, or if you're going for teen idol looks and things, he wouldn't be your first choice. But then I think Brian, because of his love for the other three, the band as they had been,
Yeah,
will have seen very quickly. We'll just spot it. Actually, no, this guy is definitely the right guy. The other three love him. He's approachable and pleasant and funny and all this kind of stuff. So Brian was won over as well. Maybe against his commercial judgment, but he was won over. And then, of course, that proved to be a huge commercial win anyway, because Ringo's drumming was part of the formula
yeah.
that saw them conquer the world. And there's
That's
no
right.
two ways about it.
And I've always felt this as I've thought more about the subject, and come to it from the 70s, and that is that the early, there's been this, like, for many decades, this rarefication of the late Beatles, partly because the period nearest to us, 67 to 70, also because studio trickery gets more sophisticated and so on, and then there's the stories of it beginning to unravel that we're all fascinated with. But you can't understand not just the Beatles, but even Britain and popular culture without understanding 63 to 64, because the Beatles change everything in with the Royal Variety performance and the Command performance and everything, Beatlemania. And Ringo's drumming on those early tracks, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, apart from the fact they're just like, these are 2.5 minutes of genius, a pop genius that are just still brilliant. He is, from an early point, just like, there's something there in his drumming, and then there's the evolution of it.
Electrifying. And I think we've spoken about this before, that he maybe wasn't best served by recording technology of the time. So it's difficult that that you couldn't have a good bass drum back in the early 60s, because too big a bass would make the needle jump out the groove of the record. So
That's right.
the mixes were always very top heavy. So you got a lot of cymbal. And if you're listening to the original recordings, it doesn't sound great anymore. Now that we're used to cleaner recordings and better mixes and things. But as we enter the era of the remix and the remaster, it's absolutely clear that he was just on it right from day one. And his, the new mixes tend to be quite rhythm section heavy. Paul's bass and Ringo's drums tend to be brought up, and to the great improvement of a lot of the material, I think. And you just can't find fault in what Ringo's doing, really, in either phase or in any of the phases of the band's development.
Yeah,
it's a treat to watch.
In that, to me, in my experience and thinking about Ringo's drumming and the evolution of the Beatles, tracks like, obviously, I love all the periods of their music and all the periods of Ringo's drumming in the band, but the period of 65, when towards the end, obviously Rubber Soul's this huge jump compared to Help and what came before, but the drumming and just the sound on things like Day Tripper and Paperback Writer, whereas your comment on, they're searching for, within the limits of technology, a punchier sound. They're saying, why can't we get the punch that Stax get and Otis Redding get? And apart from the fact these are songs of social commentary, a bit maybe in the ways Ray Davies and the Kinks in a similar terrain, Ringo's drumming absolutely adds to the punch of these songs.
Yes, I think, speaking of Ray Davies, he wrote a fairly uncharitable review of Revolver when it came out, didn't he?
That's right, he did.
He was pretty underwhelmed, but I think he had praise for Ringo, So I suspect Ray, like nearly everybody else, just didn't see Ringo as someone that you had to. I mean, Ray's a sensitive artist, like John. Paul doesn't seem to be too bothered by this. I think maybe Paul's more secure in his own genius than some of the others are. But none of them feel threatened by Ringo, and none of them feel that they have to kind of put him down. And so that leaves them free to see that he is actually, just how good he is. So in that kind of slightly scathing review of Revolver, Ringo comes in for praise in a way that John and Paul don't really. I think probably, as you say, that was kind of when they were first making a wee foray into social commentary, and they did things like Eleanor Rigby, which, as a first foray, that ain't bad. But I can imagine Ray feeling, hang on a second, I've been doing this for 2-3 years now, and I'm not getting the acclaim that the Beatles are getting. So I can imagine he may have been a tiny bit bitter and inclined to be overcritical there. But even in that mood, he still has time to enjoy Ringo's performance, which is nice.
It is an example, though, and it's fascinating. It comes from Ray Davies, given he was a pioneer then and subsequently. It's how pop criticism was, as you know, well behind the trend of where rock and pop were going and breaking new ground. But so Ray Davies, who's this groundbreaker musically himself, is like, it's like, the teeny mag kind of like idea of music criticism. It's fascinating that he would be both once this pioneer at the same time so conservative and holding back.
I'd be interested to ask Ray Davies what he thinks of Revolver now. I wonder if his opinion has evolved. I wonder if he regrets that youthful criticism. I'm sure it was maybe it was just the kind of 1966 equivalent of clickbait, that one, but I'm sure he may have revised his views over the years, because Revolver has obviously stood the test of time as well as any piece of pop culture of the last 100 years.
Although, I mean, who would have thought, who would ever think that, like Ray Davies writing that review in, I can't remember if it was a teeny mag or whatever, but not writing it as pop criticism, music criticism, that 59 years later, nearly 60 years, people would, like us and many others, would be referring to it, that
it's still talking about it. It's that weird thing of a lot of the culture was obviously thought of as throwaway. And so a lot of what was thought of as disposable has become enshrined. So we have this strange, and it's not really kitsch, because it's not that thing of sort of ironically rolling your eyes and saying, oh yeah, that was good. It genuinely just is that period was much more interesting historically than the folk living through it could possibly have known, because you don't know your place in history until many, many, many years have gone by. So that's a curious aspect of it all, isn't it? Revolver was also the period when some of the biggest advances in studio technology for drum recording were made, and huge kudos to Jeff Emmerich for his contributions. So I think that was the first one where they really close mic'd the drums, individual drums, in the back in the day, like in the famous one-day session for the first Beatles album. It would have been one mic just hanging over the drum kit, picking up every sound. And then Jeff Emmerich realized, I think at Ringo's request, as you say, how do we get that pumping bass? He close mic'd the bass drum, stuffed something inside it, and that's totally standard practice now, and putting things on the snares to damp them, towels and things, and really thinking about mic positioning and where should the cymbal mic go and how do we mix this together, but still all within the limitations of a 4-track recording. So they all have to be bounced down to a single thing. But from that, you really start to get the technical possibilities of bringing the musicality of the drums much more to the fore, and they made the very most of that. From that point on. And of course, I know you have a particular fondness for the drumming on Abbey Road, with good reason.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I would also say Jeff Emmerich's book Here, There and Everywhere is a fascinating guide, not clearly an impartial guide to his years as a studio wizard with the Beatles, because he really doesn't have much time for George Harrison for
he doesn't, does he?
Inexplicable reason. But it's still absolutely fascinating because he was there. And yes, it's partly through understanding the albums, not just the songs, but sonically, and then the combination with the two. And clearly, there's a jump from. I mean, there's difference between every single album in lots of ways, but the sonic jump from 68 to 69 and Abbey Road is just. I mean, it's the Beatles album that sounds most contemporary. And I mean, much as I'm a bit of a hi-fi buff, I don't believe music is about hi-fi buffery. That takes us to prog rock and Tubular Bells and all sorts of other, to my mind, musical horrors.
I love Tubular Bells. We must talk about that sometime.
and you could say the Beatles have a role in this, or how people interpret the Beatles. But and Lennon's disdain for the long medley of the second side, but the sound of it is fantastic, and the sound of Ringo's drumming on certain points, on Something, Here Comes the Sun, I Want You, She's So Heavy, as well as the last 3 proper tracks of the album leading to the end, are just brilliant.
Yes, Although again, at the time, I believe there was some criticism that it sounded sterile. It was almost too clean for some people's ears. I suspect, as usual, some people were just keen to, iconoclastic people wanted to knock them for any reason. But it's definitely a step forward in studio possibilities. It was their only album done on 8-track. Is that right? I think
that's right. Yeah.
So they had more room, and there's the Moog, so there's synthesized sounds as well, which was unusual for them. These days, it's funny because we don't consume. I mean, there's no reason why anyone would need to consume the Beatles' music in chronological order anymore. It comes at you when it comes at you. So we have a different experience of it all, and it certainly is only relatively recently that I realized these sort of developments, these technical developments, and the where they came in time, and how they could have at the time been quite startling to the ears of listeners who hadn't heard that sort of thing before. But yes, the Abbey Road drumming is fantastic, and of course his only official drum solo is in there in
Right.
in the
And
end.
then, like, obviously the beautiful trading guitar solos of
Yes.
John, Paul, and George beforehand. And I think they come at it 3 times each, don't they? In terms
Yes.
of which is just, and I think I can't remember if it was George's idea. I think it should have been George's idea, but I'm just not 100% sure on that. It is funny that in that culture, then, so as we all know, and we've sort of referred to, the Beatles and then the Stones were always seen as in the shadow, and the way, like, you know, one disaster was, like, obviously they followed Sgt. Pepper with their Satanic Majesty's Request, an album I quite like, actually. It's got its high point. But then as things get more serious, you know, divisive, the Vietnam War, the May protests of '68 across Europe and the world, and the Stones respond with Beggar's Banquet and Let It Bleed. Those are seen rock review wise. Also, rock reviews are coming into being, you know, therefore they are viewed as authentic albums of the times and responding to the demand for, like, you know, serious lyrics and statements. And the Beatles' White Album and Abbey Road mostly are quite a bit contemporaneously are not viewed that way. You know, as you know, the Beatles' White Album's viewed as like it's a kind of parody, it's a panoply of different styles, it's not authentic. And in Abbey Road, a little bit, some of that as well. Not all, there's some very good reviews of Abbey Road, but it's the way in which the Stones at that point leapfrog the Beatles.
Right, yeah. That's interesting, because I mean, I can't muster any belief in the sincerity of Mick Jagger caring about anything other than Mick Jagger. So I think, you know, musically the Stones have their brilliant moments without doubt, and some of their singles are, you know, timeless. But yeah, the Stones as social commentators, they wouldn't be my first choice. I think that John Lennon was the most conflicted about that business about, you know, speaking out about politics. But at the same time, he also stated in lots of interviews that he's not really interested in doing kind of reportage songs. He's exploring himself. He's just his own psyche and his own relationships, and not to be crass, but as he put it in one interview, you know, did I have a good shit this morning? And that kind of, you know, that's what he was doing, which in its way at the time was as innovative as, maybe even more innovative than the straight sort of protest song type thing, which had its heyday in the early '60s with Dylan and Joan Baez and Paul Phil Ochs, I should say, and people like that. Yeah. So it's funny, but I mean, the Beatles were a pop band, and they knew they were a pop band. I think for all their Revolution No. 9s and for all their you know, experimentalism, they knew what they were. And the person, I think the one of them that knew the best what they were was Ringo. You know, or he really understood what made them so lovable and so enjoyable. He understood that there was a Paul too, to obviously a large extent, but the lineage or the genealogy of their music going back to sort of music hall and sing songs around the piano in the family home. It was Paul and Ringo that really kept that idea going. And post breakup, Ringo made a bit of a career of it, really, while Paul was still, he has his occasional delve into what John rather cruelly referred to as granny music, but Ringo had whole albums of classics and favorites and, you know, family favorites. And even in his originals albums, they are mostly about having a knees up and having a bunch of pals round and a cheering chorus of friends. And that's kind of, he carried that torch through the divisive period of the early '70s when John and Paul were bickering, and, you know, George is producing wonderful music, but even George's second album is, in fact, both his first 2 albums are replete with songs about how awful it was being a Beatle. And, you know, Ringo's post-Beatle song is early 1970, which is it's just a lovely little kind of plea to his pals. You know, it'd be nice to get back to you, shall we?
When I encountered early 1970 initially, you know, as a kid, I couldn't believe its joy and its wit and intelligence. The fact that emotional intelligence, musical intelligence. Ringo wrote this. It's a love letter to his 3 Beatle colleagues, and written in 1970, just after some of the most difficult periods. Paul, like, throwing him out his house and so on. You know, that story well known, obviously, about Let It Be, and you know, Ringo's solo career, 70 to 75, the Apple years, is, I mean, I'm afraid there's 21 solo Ringo albums. I checked, you know, and many EPs. Some poor Beatle collectors will have all those solo albums, as well as all the live albums. But the Apple years, the singles, Don't Come Easy, Back Off Boogaloo, he was, for a period in America, the most successful Beatles solo in the US singles chart for the first few years, which just, like, beggars belief now, but that's a fact. And Photograph and Year 16 from the great Ringo album, that's the nearest we got to Beatles, both US number 1s. But it's how to sort of like put this chronologically wise, but Ringo's done all these albums post-Apple. He's done all these live albums with the All-Star band, which had friends like Joe Walsh and everything, and Dr. John. There's 10 live albums, 8 of them with the All-Star band. And when I had a brief look through them and listened to some of the stuff, it's interesting what he covers and what he doesn't cover, because in not one of those 10 albums does he cover early 1970.
Yeah, it's such a shame. It's such a shame. I wonder if he's just forgotten about it, or it wasn't a hit. It was a B-side, wasn't it? But I think it's on. It's on the reissues of. Is it Boku? No, which one is it on?
On the it's obviously on Blast from the Past,
right.
And is it on? I'm just trying to see it. It's also on the certainly my CD issue of Ringo.
Yes, right.
Which,
yeah.
I don't know if it's on the current issue of Ringo, obviously. But no, it has been more and more loved. It was. Blast from the Past was 1975, so Apple recognised its importance as the only Ringo B-side they put on that album. But yet, maybe Ringo thinks like it's because it has Paul in the past tense about John. He's going to be playing with John and George, but he hopes to play with Paul. Maybe he feels a little bit embarrassed by that, but it's genuine and joyful.
Yes, and there's no question about which period he's talking about, because the song's called early 1970s. So I think most listeners could figure out that actually maybe it didn't stay quite like that. I think the lovely thing about Ringo's early success as a solo artist is how utterly delighted the other three were for him.
Yeah.
I think while John and Paul were kind of watching each other's singles and where they went with slightly avaricious eyes or with very competitive eyes, and at certain periods, I think John proclaimed himself more or less just done with the competition because Paul was doing so well and he just didn't feel he could reach those sort of commercial heights again. But at no point was anybody anything other than delighted for Ringo's successes. And in fact, to the point where they actually wrote a fair few of his hits. Of course, George in particular in the early 70s was writing and producing for Ringo, often without credit, just because he wanted Ringo to get the credit, which is that's a lovely friend thing to do. We won't go into some of the other aspects of the Ringo-George dynamic, I don't think, will we? Or certainly where wives are concerned, because that's
they reached various impasses in the 70s involving, obviously, the George relationship with Maureen Starkey, and then he has the wit not to tell Ringo to his face about it, But then there's also on the Ringo post-Apple album, there's the Harrison track that George decides to sue Ringo for it. Doesn't like the changes in production he's made to it. And they get past both. Obviously, the first one's much more serious, one would guess. But they get past both of these. Absolutely get past these in terms of their friendship, which does say something.
It does. It's the kind of thing you'd hope for in a family, really, isn't it? That, blood is thicker than water. It is like they were a family. And Ringo does always refer to the other three as his brothers, because he was an only child, Ringo, and he grew up a bit lonely. I mean, not a part, but hospital visits obviously weren't the best time. But even at home, he was at home as an only child, and that camaraderie and family element of the band, I think, saved his life probably on more than one occasion, I would imagine.
That's true. There's something funny going on in the world of Ringo reissues at the moment, which is so this year, 2025, has seen all the 4 studio albums of the Apple years all issued on coloured vinyl, because in terms of the collector fads and everything and completists, there's some poor souls out there. I'm not trying to be judgmental, but they're parting with their cash for such things, from Sentimental Journey to Be Out of the Blues to Ringo, and then Goodnight Vienna. So they've all come out on coloured vinyl. There's a thought that there may be a continuation of that programme next year in terms of like selling us all things Beatle. But what there isn't is, there's not a box set for the Apple years as there has been for George. That's one thing. Maybe that's just too much Ringo for the market or what Apple think. But secondly, this is the main one people miss and think. The Ringo album isn't just important for Ringo. It's the nearest we ever got to a Beatles reunion, and it's a charming album with hit singles and a joie de vivre, references back to Sgt. Pepper, John parodying himself on "I'm the Greatest," and it's if we can't have a reissue of that as a Ringo album, there's no hope for a Ringo reissue. Really, is that a proper reissue?
Yeah. That it comes back to what you were saying about the kind of, there's a recent reassessment, so the things like that uncut issue. Of course, now it seems logical that there should be a Ringo one if there's a John one, a Paul one, and a George one. But for many, many years, that wasn't the case. It was deemed perfectly okay to assume that Ringo was kind of the he's, you know, we don't really worry about what he's done. And he was the last one to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. And it had to be, I think Paul had to lobby the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to get Ringo in, because all the other three were in both as Beatles and as solo artists. And Ringo's solo career definitely warrants, I mean, just, you know, Ringo as a person deserves to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame if anybody does. Yeah. But we should, it's been all good news so far for Ringo up until the mid-70s, but things begin to take a bit of a dip in about 74, 75.
Marriage breaks up. I mean, him and Maureen divorce in 75, and he's part of Lennon's Lost Weekend. He marries Barbara Bach in 1981, the Hollywood actress, and they together go into a vortex of, like, you know, hell, etc., in terms of stuff, and famously publicly pull out of it. And Ringo's been clean since 1988, I think it is, and but several times he's put himself through, you know, lived life to the max.
It has to tremendous detriment. But I think we often talk about how astonishing it is that the Beatles, the four individuals themselves, survived such an unprecedented level of fame and such a series of experiences that would drive many of us completely doolally, and many of their contemporaries doolally. And when they broke up, although they all had bleak times, they still seemed to be sane, you know, together people by and large. But Ringo did have probably the hardest time, certainly in the late 70s. He really, when you see interviews with him at that point, he does look like a lost soul. And I know John had his so-called Lost Weekend, but he made albums during that time which are still well regarded, and he produced Harry Nilsson's album, which is well regarded, and of course got back with Yoko and chose a slightly different lifestyle to raise his second son Sean as a house husband, which was revolutionary in its own way. Ringo is just kind of left stranded in the world of the bon vivant and the drunken rabble rousers of LA. So there was a group called the Hollywood Vampires, which included Keith Moon and one of the Monkees. Which one was it? Mickey Dolenz, and who else was in there? Obviously Harry Nilsson and John. And really they'd have been an extremely objectionable bunch of folk to come across, I think. Yeah.
I think they were,
not good fun. It was the point at which that kind of drunken jollity just did topple into just boorish, pretty desperate behavior. And it's visible in some of Ringo's public appearances in the late 70s and early 80s.
It is. And I suppose, I mean, because what we haven't touched on that is Ringo's parallel career from post-1970 of being a session drummer, being in supportive of other people. He's all the famous John Lennon Plastic Ono Band album, the Primal Scream album. He's the drummer on that. He's the drummer on part of All Things Must Pass, in amongst the chorus of everyone else, and other George albums. He's there on the concert for Bangladesh. And I think probably, again, like the Apple period, I mean, it's maybe just a little bit too tidy, but he in the early 70s, he manages to adapt a bit. Clearly, while he has, I mean, he said this, he's missing his friends and his family, the Beatles, but he's got this hectic life of sessions and appointments. And then that all begins to fall apart through various choices, through the divorce, through Apple, they all leave Apple, etc. And his solo career, which has been very successful, I mean, it crashes. It's obviously Ringo's not comparable on his own to the Beach Boys, but the Beach Boys post Pet Sounds, post Smile in America commercially crashed in the late 62, an embarrassing point, with albums that are now revered like Friends and so on, and Wild Honey. And Ringo's albums are an embarrassing chart position. Like, I think Bad Boys like number 161 or something in America. He's dropped by several record companies that have paid him millions and so on. It's not a great tale from such a high point, even after the Beatles.
Yes, and I think, I mean, America was actually kinder to him than the UK was, because even quite early on, when he was still having hits in the States, Britain seemed to have lost interest in what Ringo was doing. That's probably part of our kind of maybe national desire to build folk up and knock them down, which is a bit of a shame. Of course, George was going through a tricky time. They did all have a bit. Paul was the one who kind of survived the late 70s the best, and in fact became an international rock star again in his own right with a different outfit, making fair good use of some of the Beatles' heritage, it has to be said, as indeed was his right. But Ringo just never managed to. I think the trouble was, folk didn't know what to do with Ringo, you know, because he'd shown talent as an actor in A Hard Day's Night and in one or two other things. And so there was this notion that Hollywood was going to be his next career, but he was so hideously miscast in almost everything. They just, you know, and I don't know if they were hoping that just having a Beatle in the film would be enough to bring folk in. They certainly don't seem to have made much effort to think what would fall within his range. So there's one example, That'll Be the Day, which is the story of early rock and roll with David Essex, as the hero, and Ringo plays a kind of road weary old rocker in a kind of Butlins holiday camp type setting, very similar to his own early days. And the clips I've seen of that, I haven't seen the whole film, but he looks great in that. He's, you know, he draws the attention as soon as he's on screen. He has got a magnetism about him, but he can't really express that if he's being cast as a Mexican gardener in some hideous late 60s, early 70s.
It's a great film.
Comedy.
That'll Be the Day, and I think it's. I think it was even understood like this at the time. I think is that it very much plays into and amplified the rock and roll nostalgia that was building in the early 70s. That was referencing the actually people that influenced the Beatles and so on. And I think That'll Be the Day plays a similar role in British culture to American graffiti in America. And obviously that's something that you could say, you know, nostalgia has eaten us in a way, and hence even this discussion now and many others. But then it was, you know, it played into people doing cover albums. So Bowie, Brian Ferry, obviously John Lennon, early examples of cover albums covering, you know, previous influences. And That'll Be the Day is you know, important in that, and I think it is, apart from Hard Day's Night, Ringo's best acting by a mile in a decently executed film. And David Essex is a, you know, decent actor in that as well. Yes,
but some of the other castings sort of betoken the sense that Ringo was seen as a bit of a comedy turner, a bit of a, you know, an afterthought, or just he certainly does not seem to receive the respect that he very much deserved. I think he did in the music community. So the band had him playing on The Last Waltz and things like that. You know, he definitely has always had the respect of his peers. But outside the auspices of a nice tight unit, he does seem to have just been somewhat adrift for quite a long time. But thank goodness, as you say, he's come out of it. And he's inspired other folk to come out of those sort of downward spirals as well. You know, he's very supportive to friends in the All-Star Band. The music industry is awash with booze and drugs, as you no doubt know, and it's almost seen as a rite of passage, or it's seen as a, you know, it's almost unusual for a musician not to be a heavy drinker or a drug user or things like that. And it's an extraordinarily difficult environment to clean yourself up in, I think. So he deserves unbelievable respect for that. He and Barbara, mutual support, and that's a love story for the ages as well. Really, you know, it's unequal to Paul and Linda in terms of their total devotion over the years. Well, I think possibly you could say, because, you know, I mean, Paul and Linda is a great love story too, which is nice. But Barbara and Ringo are still together and still very happily married and mutually supportive and things. And of course, his musical career has had a late blossoming as well with his live act, his touring act, the All-Star Band.
Yes. I think that's true, and you know, it's a phenomenon, and it's successful. I mean, I think it's a bit predictable and all that, and playing to that nostalgia, etc. But you know, it's sort of charming, isn't it? It has its worth. I mean, the world does not need 10 Ringo albums, or certainly there's nobody who really needs 10 Ringo albums. You know, you can choose.
Possibly not. No.
But it's a mixture of a law of diminishing returns from the first one. But it's true in the 10, having done a brief review of them, is that as they go on, the choices get a little bit more eclectic. So I noticed that, like, obviously, you know, we said early 1977, not on any of them, but Back Off Boogaloo eventually makes an appearance. Octopus's Garden, which is, you know, I've always thought it's charming.
Brilliant song. I love it.
Yeah. I mean, Alan Klein thought it was enough to be on 67 to 70, you know.
Right,
And so it gets more eclectic in a way. And I don't know. I mean, if Ringo was coming to town to evoke the song, you know, you'd want to go along and play, wouldn't you?
You would, absolutely. I would love to see the All-Star Band. I mean, I think that I have gone through years of wondering why anybody would want to go and see that. But actually now, now I've actually seen some and heard some. I mean, they are all superb musicians. I think to get into the All-Star Band, you have to have had a hit, an international hit, and be up for touring. So he has got an amazing cast of characters. But again, it's that thing of him and Paul both understanding their role as entertainers. Now, had John survived, I don't think he'd have been out doing crowd-pleasing shows. And I think he probably should have, because I think if you want to understand your own legacy, you need to recognize the bit that folks enjoy. If you are going to be an entertainer as well as an artist, I think John was artist first and entertainer second. And I think Ringo's maybe been entertainer first and artist second. But he knows what folk want. He enjoys a good knees up. He loves live music. And so he's giving folk what they want. And it's a generous thing for an 83-year-old man to be doing,
So as a penultimate subject before we get on to the conclusion, is just want to ask you on this. So in the Beatles and the Ringo story, there is the thorny issue of the tracks "Free as a Bird," "Real Love," and "Now and Then." What do you think? Not so much of those tracks. You can that we talk about that as well. But what do you think of Ringo's drumming on those tracks?
I think it is a tough one. I mean, the drumming on the first two of those, "Free as a Bird" and "Real Love," I know that we had different experiences because I was a perfect age when they came out, because I didn't just the very possibility of going out and buying a contemporary Beatles single, and you can argue about whether it's authentic Beatles or not, was so exciting, and the whole build up and that whole there was a half-hour telly special that ended with the debut of the video and all that kind of stuff. I loved it, but listening to it now, those are turgid drums. They are turgid, but I don't think that's Ringo's fault. I think that's Jeff Lynne's production more than Ringo's drumming. And I haven't heard the new remixes because I know they've cleaned up John's vocal for the new remix of "Free as a Bird," but I don't know if they've taken off that wretched thundering.
I listened to it the other day. I mean, I listened to it when they released it, but I listened to it the other day, deliberately listening for that, and it is better.
Okay.
It is. It's still got a slight echo of that, but it's, to my ear anyway, it's better, and also it sounds as it goes along the track, it gets better. But it's also the way, as you know, the beat of that track is like funereal. It's not got a joy to it. Well, there is a joy to it, but it's a sort of understated, like, to me, turgid joy. In terms of because clearly there's a joy in hearing their harmonies and the four of them together, even though I think it's a bit of a Frankenstein creation, and I don't think it's a real Beatles track, etc. But yes, it sounded, when I've listened to it recently, the 1995 version sounds just like what you'd think an ELO Travelling Wilburys track would sound, which I don't think I thought at the time. I think I was probably a little bit, just swept away, even though I had problematic views of it. But they've made it better. But Real Love, it's fascinating. They can't let it lie. Real Love, they've replaced at least parts of Lennon's vocals with bits from other demos of Real Love.
Right.
Because the phrasing's different in certain words, distinctly different, and a couple of the words are even different. So it's from different takes. And then they've knocked, admittedly it's at the end of the track, but some people are going in the world of the internet, going mental on this. As the song fades, there's a George, it's not quite a solo, full solo, but they've cut a bit of George, and they've also cut 20 seconds from the song. So some people are going, maybe this doesn't matter, but they can't let it lie. It's like the versions of the Let It Be album we've got. We don't need multiple versions of Free as a Bird and Real Love.
No, we really don't, and especially in this age when the technology exists for folk to just go ahead and make their own mixes if they want to. If you've got Logic or something on your computer, you can get everything to the stems, so you can separate all the tracks and you can do what you want. I think that Real Love actually diminished Free as a Bird. I think they should have either done three, one to go in each of the anthology albums. That would have made sense, or just done the one to as a nod to John. But Real Love, I was genuinely disappointed when it came out. I was so excited about Free as a Bird, but Real Love, I already knew the song. I hadn't heard the demo of Free as a Bird, but Real Love was in the public domain because it features in the Imagine film, and it was the same drum sound. And then they had a different. It was a similar paced song as well. They just were not. I mean, George Harrison was quite critical of John's late writing. He said he dropped off a bit, and John did fall into sort of repeated patterns. But you have to remember, he wasn't doing these for public consumption. These were home demos that he was making. I'm sure if he had been involved in a record, because bear in mind, things like "Please Please Me" was going to be a slow Orbison-esque thing, and John was perfectly open to that being sped up and given a bit of pep. But he wasn't there to make those decisions at the time, and so they were stuck with what they had. And unfortunately, Jeff Lynne, Jeff Lynne seems like an absolutely lovely bloke, I have to say, and he was a really good friend to George and all that kind of stuff. But he has a particular understanding of what he liked about the Beatles, and it isn't necessarily what everybody else liked about the Beatles. And so he's, after years of doing his own sort of tribute stroke pastiche work, getting his hands on those, it must have been overwhelming for him. But I think Real Love was the misstep. I loved Now and Then when it came out as well. I decided I was going to, because there are so many reasons to be cynical about it and to doubt its kind of how deserving it is to enter the canon. Yeah. But I think if you just cast that aside and just say, this is it's quite a nice little sort of topping off of but it would have been nice if it was a topping off, but it's not a topping off. You know, if they had genuinely said, this is the final release, it's the last.